Your voice, your opinion, your community. Fact TV, free speech protected.
Good evening, and welcome to another edition of What Do You Think? My name is Bill Morse, and today is Thursday, March 10th, 2022, and this is Oliver. We are pre-recording this program. So unfortunately, you will not be able to call in and comment, but you're welcome to, well, I'm not sure we're going to be live next week either. But anyway, we are here pre-recording this program, and you are seeing it Thursday, March 10th, 2022. And this is Oliver, who likes to lick. Okay. So I thought we would talk a little bit about a situation that has been with us ever since the end of COVID, and that is the situation in the Ukraine. Now, I'll be honest with you, Ukraine is not really a country. I've never been to the Ukraine. I've never really thought much about the Ukraine, except maybe a little bit over the last 5 or 6 years, especially with Vice President Biden being in office and Hunter Biden, his son, having dealings with an energy concern in the Ukraine, and issues about corruption in the Ukraine under the government of Viktor Yanukovych. So that's all really I've known about the Ukraine. Occasionally I visit a YouTube channel called Bald and Bankrupt. And Bald and Bankrupt, his name is Ben Rich. He's from Bristol or Brighton, southern part of England. On the Brighton is on the English Channel. And he makes a point, he has over the last 3 or 4 years of visiting former Soviet republics, such as Belarus. Come on, I want you to listen to this. Belarus, Ukraine, all the stands, Dagestan, Turkestan. I mean, many countries, the Baltic states that were not part of the Soviet Union, but were definitely behind the so-called Iron Curtain, which divided East from West Germany and then consumed all the countries in what is now considered Central Europe and Eastern Europe. Actually reaching down into Asia towards the Middle East and further eastward towards India. So it was interesting learning a little bit about the Ukraine from Bald and Bankrupt, and also a little bit from the Obama/Biden administration when they were here from about, I guess, 2008 to 2016. Okay. So a lot of us have been given a certain version of what's happening over there now with regards to this push-pull between Western Europe and Russia. Western Europe, of course, also meaning the United States, since we are allied with Western Europe and we are a strong supporter of NATO. So, a little bit of background. The Soviet Union, of which Ukraine was part of, broke up in 1991, I believe. And a lot of these, Russia and a number of other former Soviet republics, kind of were controlled by, let's say, different groups, criminal groups, mafia-type groups, during the chaos that followed when the Soviet Union no longer was a military force, no longer was an administrative force, no longer was overseeing government or what private industry there was or government industry. So it was a free-for-all. And unlike Eastern Germany, which had the benefit of the West with its money and human and natural resources, monetary resources, to kind of pull them from a state-run economy to a more privately run economy, private sector economy. These other countries are kind of left on their own hanging. Their state-run industries closed. People were thrown out of work. And no one had really a good playbook on how to organize or run a government per democracy, per a vote of the majority as to what direction they would take. So you had kind of like a dark 90s, a hangover in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The hangover kind of was relieved, let's say, by Western interests coming in to fill a vacuum and try to take advantage of the disorder to establish markets over there. Whether it's a food chain or a large drink producer or an energy concern or just about anything that the private market takes care of, that came into play, and there were elections, and in 2010 in the Ukraine, and the Ukraine is kind of an interesting place. Most people have heard of the Ukraine if they've studied communism. They know that the Ukraine was and still is the breadbasket, and that Joseph Stalin in the early 30s, who was the head of the Soviet Union, very much made all the decisions, started the collectivization of agriculture or farms, in which the state took property or farmland and organized agriculture along a central 5-year plan. And so that meant that many farmers lost control, all farmers lost control of their property and were told how to plant, where to plant, and the government would come and take whatever yield they had from their crops, in this case wheat, rye, barley, what was used to make bread or bread products. And because of the rigid control in the 30s and the fact that the goal was more important than the process, there was a famine. And because with many central organized authoritarian powers that ignore or disregard local input, local situations, it failed. And you had perhaps 5 million people in the early part of the 30s starve to death. And this information wasn't shared by the media because the media was censored. And I think it was only till after Stalin died in 1953 that the West learned the full extent of the starvation that took place in the Ukraine, which was called the breadbasket of Russia or of the Soviet Union. The 5 million people that perished, that starved to death because they did not have control over their agriculture. They grew the food, but the food was taken from them through this collectivization process. So, anyway, besides that, Ukraine also has other resources. It's not landlocked. They have a beautiful port, Odessa. If you look at our air map, you have the Ukraine here, you have Poland here on the left side, and on the right side you have the Russia. You have the Black Sea down at the south, and Odessa is the port in the Black Sea. And the Black Sea gives maritime access to the world because the Black Sea empties out through Istanbul, all right, Turkey, into the Mediterranean. So it's an important country. It's got a good geographic location, and many people in the West saw the potential to make money there, corporations. And I think that's when we first started seeing politicians and politician families take advantage of kind of weak leadership and supplant that through American influence with chosen people that would be more cooperative with the U.S. in governing Ukraine than they would be with Russia. So Ukraine was kind of in a push-pull situation. In the East, you had Russian influence, ethnic Russians, and in the West, you had a population that was looking more towards the West, and as I said, in the East, looking towards the East. So you have very different orientation politically of people in the same country. And so naturally, that's going to potentially lead to problems, and it has. Bringing us up to date, I wanted to give us a bit of an idea as to the current situation. We've had a number of people. I want to read off 4 names and see if you get something in common. Well, actually, before that, let's go back to who was the president. Viktor Yanukovych was the president, elected in 2010. He was more leaning towards the East and was more of a friend of the Russians, Vladimir Putin, than he was of the Obama regime or the United States and NATO. He was in office for 4 years, very authoritarian by our standards, and not really more interested in keeping ties with Russia than the United States or than with Western Europe. Probably because of the energy supplies that would be coming from Russia, oil, gas, etc. And so there was an election, and many people in the western part of the Ukraine voted against Yanukovych, and they voted in favor of the U.S.-backed candidate who was Volodymir Zalenski. And Volodymir Zalenski, his background was not political. He was an actor, and he was sponsored. He was basically sponsored by the United States and Western European powers, Germany, for example. And he won in the 2014 election through massive American support. Now, we have had this issue of Russia interfering with our elections. At least that's the allegations. Whether or not that's true, I always thought that this was kind of like karmic justice, because we've certainly, our country has certainly interfered with elections in other countries. Earlier on with the CIA, for example, assassinating a democratically elected president in Guatemala in '54, I believe, and whereby we don't do assassinations anymore, we certainly throw money at the candidate that we think is going to represent our interests in another country. So we are actually very much guilty of influencing elections in other democratic countries when it's in our best interest. And that best interest could be from a security standpoint, it could be from an economic standpoint, a trade standpoint. So very, very gray areas. So anyway, Volodymir, I've got the accent right. Volodymir Zalenski becomes the president in 2016, and he has Yanukovych put in prison because he fears that Yanukovych will not accept the election results. According to the Yanukovych team, the election was rigged and had millions of American dollars behind it, so that, but by the same token, I'm sure Yanukovych also had Russian money behind his team, behind his re-election effort. So you've got a tug of war between East and West, and Ukraine is currently being trashed as a result of this tug of war. So now that we have our man Volodymyr Zalenski in the White House version of the government there in Kiev, in the Ukraine, we've had American diplomats and politicians, their families, invest in different parts of the Ukrainian economy. Biden, Pelosi, Romney, and Kerry, these families all have vested interests, whether it's in energy or transportation or in software development, technology. They have money invested in the Ukraine. So you've got really a very slippery slope here when we have elected officials, senators, congressmen, people that are in charge of very important committees, such as Kerry with climate action. You have them steering policy in different directions or in one direction, and that is in a direction from which they're going to benefit financially. Conflict of interest, big conflict of interest, at least in my opinion. So what happens is gradually you first go in and you have corporate interests that are aligned with U.S. interests that are being developed in the Ukraine. And eventually you have those corporate interests being entwined with military interests. So when the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991, there was a promise that NATO would not expand eastward. In other words, NATO would stay within the realm of Germany and offering protection of Western Europe from any aggression, be it from the east or some other part of the world. And we all know that the military-industrial complex, through the fact that it employs so many people, that it enjoys a very large amount of our budget. By the way, I thought it would be interesting to compare our budget with other countries. I found the figures for what we budget for the military here in the U.S. and in other countries to make a very quick comparison. In 2020, Russia spent $61 billion on its military. $61 billion on its military. Okay? China, by comparison, spent $252 billion in 2020 on its military. Okay? Just take a guess as to how many billions we spent in 2020 on our military. Got any ideas? $778 billion. $778 billion the United States spent on its military in 2020. Now, that doesn't count the billions of dollars that had to go for COVID relief because the COVID episode shut down our economy. And it doesn't count also the amount of money that is secretly spent on the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, which is anything but democratic. We don't even know what they're doing. In fact, we don't even know what our own government is doing, the part that does have a published budget. So anyway, we now have a $30 trillion debt, $30 trillion debt as of 2022. So it basically comes down to money and resources, and NATO being our military arm. Instead of sending in the U.S. Army or the Marines, we have NATO, and we send them material support, financial support. So as I was saying 2 minutes ago, NATO promised in 1991, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that they would stay within their boundaries. In other words, they would not go further east than the border between Germany and Poland. Well, NATO is now not only in Poland, but I believe NATO is going to be going into the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania very soon. Belarus, which is just above the Ukraine, is aligned with Russia. Okay, so they're not going to be NATO anytime soon. Ukraine, though, is very close to having NATO come in. In fact, this is where the issue comes in, where all the fighting has erupted from, is the fact that you have NATO just waiting on the sidelines at the Ukrainian border, and then we have a lot of money going into the Ukrainian military to kind of shore up its pushback against the Russians, who are coming in from the east. And we have sent over to the Ukraine over the last 5 or 6 years about $15 billion, $15 billion. And Congress is looking at sending over another $40 billion to the Ukraine to shore up the regime or the government of Volodymir Zalenski, so that he can withstand the military forces coming in from Russia. So, you wonder why we have inflation. The money is that we can't print the money up fast enough. So I find it interesting that we're more worried about the Ukrainian border And I can see why, because we're in this Cold War type of mind frame whereby two different sides. We have the money for this, and I think it's because we have so much invested in the Ukraine. We have our president who's there. We also have, I'm sure, evidence had come to light recently in the last couple of weeks that we have biolabs that were sponsored by the Department of Defense, our military, in the Ukraine. From what I've heard, the biolabs are anywhere from 20 to 30 in number, and that one of the targets of the Russian forces that have come in from the east has been these biolabs. And these biolabs the existence of them was denied at first by our government. And now finally, I think in a hearing, we had a government official admit that the biolabs do exist and that they're there to study germ warfare and to prevent germ warfare to be used by the Russians against the Ukraine and other countries further west. There's also evidence coming out that we have biolabs in Taiwan. And many people see that China may soon make a move on the island of Taiwan. And one of the reasonings may be that they do not want to have biolabs working on biological warfare, genetically modified this and that. In other words, labs that are capable of producing COVID or even more deadlier flus that could be unleashed on the population. So we have really a very difficult situation, and it's made more difficult because in many cases we have not been told the whole story. We were not told about the biolabs. We don't know what else exists on Ukrainian soil that is sponsored by the United States or by Western powers. And it upsets me that when we are shown film footage of what is happening in Ukraine, the devastation or the attack of Russian forces on different targets, that much of the film has been proven to be video game footage or footage that had been shot in different other locations over the last couple of years. In other words, the video footage that we are shown on the evening news is faked. It's video footage that has been taken from other locations at other times, and or is from video games or is computer generated. I think we really need to think once or twice at least before we believe what we're seeing on the screen. It's almost like there's two realities. There's the reality that we are presented on a screen, and then there's whatever the real reality is in bricks and mortar over on the other side of the world. So my only solution or suggestion is that everyone please question what you're being told. We have been living through a narrative on COVID and its potential to take life, and it certainly has wrecked our economy and closed permanently 30-40% of small businesses. And it has brought our country further into debt. And now that our energy policy has changed, in which we are no longer self-reliant, we are reliant on other sources for our fuel, we have inflation, higher fuel prices, and money printed without a corresponding wealth or worth. By that I mean you have goods and services, and you have a ratio of goods and services with money that is out there, tender currency. And if you keep producing more currency or dollar bills, $20 bills, $100 bills, let's say, without having a corresponding increase in wealth, I mean goods and services, which is really wealth, then the money is going to get lower in value, and that's why we have 6-7% inflation now. We have gasoline that is headed towards $6 or $7 a gallon, and again, many things are not discussed because we're stuck in certain narratives. Now we're in the Ukraine narrative, and I don't know. I think if we tried to put ourselves in Russia's position, would we like to have, let's say, would we like to have a potential enemy on our border? Would we like to have, for example, Russia sending missiles over to Cuba, which they wanted to do under Nikita Khrushchev in 1963? We had the Cuban Missile Crisis. We sent out warships to stop Russian ships that were bringing missiles to Cuba. We blockaded the island, and so that we had a standoff. The Russians caved in and returned with their rockets to Russia, and Cuba remained missile-free. How would we feel if there was a renewed attempt to place missile bases on Cuba by Russia, and those missile bases were only 90 miles from Miami, easy striking distance of southeastern United States? Well, similar situation when you have NATO on the verge of occupying or protecting, let's say, the Ukraine, and you have Russia nearby, which is not part of the club, and has a different philosophical outlook as to nationalism, having control over its own resources without foreign interference through a corporate market economy. So I just think we should kind of step back before we, react emotionally to these pictures that in many cases seem to be falsified, seem to follow the drumbeat of one sole narrative, and that is war with Russia. And I think that many people on our side believe we could win. It's interesting. We've had it's interesting, and I think that it's a mistake to just simply go along with the narrative that is presented in the media, that is basically riding on emotion without looking at the history of corruption in this country, in the Ukraine, from both sides, influence in elections from both sides, the East, Russia, and the West, the United States and Western Europe. So I think that wraps it up. I know the flowers look good. Too bad we don't have some blue, huh? We could have some blue and yellow. Yeah. We, our family, and of course your family, wish all the best to the Ukrainian people and families that are caught in the middle of this tug of war between Russia and the United States, Russia and NATO. Probably the best solution, and I don't know how we would enforce this. We would enforce this by both sides, Russia and the United States, NATO, being part of a commission that would oversee the neutralization militarily of the Ukraine. And it would have to be a weapon-free zone in which technology, medicine, the labs, everything is open to inspection by a bipartisan committee made up of Russian officials, U.S. officials, and Western European officials. But I see the only way out of this is by making the Ukraine a buffer zone. Neither east nor west, but jointly monitored and supervised by Russian and American/Western European representatives. And I think that's the way it's going to work. Russia is not going to allow weapons on its borders, just like we would not allow rockets or weapons in Cuba or in Mexico. Let's say that Russia offered Mexico a good deal. You know, we will bankroll these different projects. We will grease a lot of wheels in Mexico. We will actually get rid of the drug cartel, but we will be in charge, and we will also install our own labs and military bases in Mexico. So, you know, you could have the Russians potentially on our border. In fact, I think that's where things might go if NATO does succeed in occupying in the Western forces, the Kerrys of the world, the Pelosi's of the world, the Mitt Romneys of the world, the Bidens of the world, if they, and the U.S. corporations, which are entwined politically, if these corporations if these Western powers are successful in consolidating Ukraine into an extension of the West, then were I Putin, I would look at moving into Mexico, dealing with the Mexican problems such as the drug cartels, and being the new southern neighbor along the new southern neighbor of the United States. I just think it would be kind of ironic and kind of a tit for tat. So the best answer in the long run to avoid this tit for tat is just to have a bipartisan committee, East and West, oversee what goes on in Ukraine and withdraw all military forces, withdraw all biolabs or destroy them, and have transparency through this oversight from both parties, and maintain a neutral nation that chooses its own path, neither east nor west, elects its own leaders who are not bought by the east or west, and definitely is not the crucible for bioengineering of offensive chemical weapons. So that's it. We're going to say good evening, and we're waiting for spring, Oliver and I, and I'm sure you are as well. So take care, and please be mindful, not everything you see on the screen is real. Good night, everyone.